A recently divorced man moves to a quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping to rebuild his life. But when he casts his first fishing line into the community lake, everything changes. He's slapped with a $500 fine by a power-hungry HOA president and humiliated publicly. But just 3 months later, that same man is paid by the city to fish in the exact same spot. What happened next uncovered a web of corruption that shook the whole community. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from and if this story moves you. Don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary Saturday afternoon. No, the kind of afternoon where sunlight dances on the still water and birds chirp like they're rehearsing for a symphony no one asked for. Jack Anderson sat alone at the edge of the lake, the same spot he had visited every weekend for the past few weeks. A folding chair dug slightly into the soft grass beneath him, and in his hand, a graphite fishing rod that had once belonged to his grandfather, old, scratched, but reliable. The kind of rod that didn't need to be fancy because it held more stories than any high-end gear from a glossy catalog. Jack cast his line into the lake like he had so many times before, the line arching like a thread of memory being pulled through time. It had been 3 months since the ink dried on the divorce papers. Diane was gone, 15 years dissolved in a few paragraphs of legalese in a courtroom sigh. She took the dog, the antique desk, and the dreams of a shared retirement in Italy. Jack got the car, the savings he'd worked 2 decades to build, and a hollow ache in his chest that refused to leave. He needed quiet. He needed water. He needed to disappear into something that didn't talk back. That's why the lake mattered. It wasn't just about fishing, it was about healing. He moved to Willow Creek Estates because of the lake. The glossy brochure at the real estate office had made it look like paradise. Private community lake, enjoy peaceful recreation steps from your door. Jack remembered those words. He remembered circling them with a red pen, a habit from his college days, as if underlining a sentence could make it come true. At first, things had seemed to align. His new house on Maple Street was modest but clean, surrounded by friendly-looking mailboxes and neatly trimmed hedges. People waved, dogs barked politely. There was a sense of order that appealed to Jack's weary soul. He made a habit of fishing every Saturday and Sunday afternoon. He'd arrive with his thermos of black coffee and a small tackle box, always leaving the area cleaner than he found it. It was his ritual, his religion, but rituals, even quiet ones, don't always go unchallenged. Jack had just reeled in a small bass, admired its shimmer for a second before releasing it back into the water. When he heard footsteps behind him, sharp, purposeful, he turned, expecting a curious neighbor or maybe a kid asking about his gear. Instead, he found himself looking up at a woman in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, standing stiffly with her arms crossed like a military general reviewing a failed inspection. "We do not allow this activity here," she said, her voice slicing through the air like a gavel. Jack blinked, confused. "I'm sorry." The woman didn't blink. "Fishing is not permitted in our community lake. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation." "I what?" "There's no sign," he replied, standing now, still trying to process. The brochure said this lake was for recreation. "Isn't fishing recreational? I'm Patricia Montgomery," she said coldly, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The HOA board determines appropriate use of amenities. Fishing has been deemed inappropriate. It degrades the aesthetic. He opened his mouth to argue, but she was already walking away. Pulling out her phone as if to report him to some invisible authority, Jack stood there, line slack, his hands cold despite the warm breeze. He wasn't just confused. He was humiliated. People walking their dogs turned their heads. A couple jogging by slowed down, clearly eavesdropping. The lake, his sanctuary, now felt like a stage, and he'd just been cast as the town delinquent. Later that evening, still rattled, Jack knocked on the door of his neighbor, Bill Thompson, a retired postal worker who spent most afternoons in a rocking chair on his porch, watching the world go by. Bill listened patiently as Jack explained what had happened, nodding slowly like he'd heard this song before. "Ah, you've met Patricia. he said finally. Our very own queen of control. She's been running this place like a private kingdom for the past 2 years. Makes up rules as she goes. Always in the name of community standards. Jack frowned. But a $500 fine. That's not a warning. That's a threat. Welcome to Willow Creek. Bill chuckled dryly. Last year she fined a woman for planting marigolds. Wrong color. Apparently, HOA guidelines said pastel tones only. Thing is, those guidelines, she writes them herself. Jack wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, a rogue rule he could clear up with a simple conversation. But then the letter arrived. A thick envelope with an official Willow Creek HOA logo embossed in blue. Inside, a neatly worded document titled Violation Notice Number 1097. It cited him for improper use of shared community resources and demanded a $500 fine payable within 30 days. If not paid, the fine would double and additional legal action could be taken. His hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was an insult, a slap across the face of everything he had tried to rebuild. Fishing wasn't a crime. It was the one thing that helped him breathe again. He looked out the window at the lake, glimmering like an old friend trying to smile through grief. He made a decision. He wouldn't pay. He wouldn't roll over. He would fight back. He dug out the home purchase documents, the HOA welcome packet, even the real estate brochure. He pored over every line like a code breaker, searching for the rule that said he couldn't fish, but it wasn't there. In fact, the opposite was true. The lake was explicitly listed as a recreational amenity. The next morning, he called Steve Mitchell, a college buddy turned civil attorney who now handled property disputes in the city. Steve answered on the second ring. Jack Anderson. He said with warmth, "How's the suburban life treating you, Jack?" Exhaled. "I need a favor. And I think I just stepped into something bigger than I expected." Steve listened carefully. When Jack finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "Don't pay a cent," Steve said. "This smells like classic HOA overreach. You've got documentation." "Right. Everything," Jack replied. "Brochure, agreement, even a map that labels the lake as a shared recreational space." "Good. Send it all over. I've dealt with bullies like this before. Let's remind them that HOA doesn't stand for high-order autocrats." Jack hung up and leaned back in his chair, the anger in his chest slowly transmuting into something sharper focus. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to find out exactly who Patricia Montgomery thought she was, and why she believed she could treat a community lake like her personal moat. That was the day it had stopped being about fishing and started becoming a war for something far deeper. Dignity, truth, and the soul of a neighborhood. You ever had something peaceful taken away from you by someone with too much power and no heart? Let me know in the comments. Because what happened next didn't just change the rules, it changed the whole game. The next morning, Jack stood in his modest kitchen, clutching a lukewarm mug of black coffee as sunlight poured through the blinds. The mug was shaking slightly in his hand, not because of the caffeine, but because the weight of what had begun to unravel was still heavy on his chest. The HOA fine hadn't just interrupted a peaceful afternoon. It had disturbed something much deeper. It had threatened the small piece of solace he had found after the chaos of divorce. After packing years of a shared life into cardboard boxes and signing away a future he once thought was guaranteed, he watched a squirrel dart across his backyard fence as his printer spat out page after page of documents: the homebuyer's agreement, HOA bylaws, the marketing brochure from Willow Creek Estates, and even an archived PDF he managed to dig up from the real estate agent's old website. Each one included a mention of the lake as a recreational space, a community centerpiece, a tranquil haven according to one particularly flowery description. Not one mentioned fishing restrictions, not one mentioned aesthetic degradation due to bass or catfish. Jack gathered the pages, clipped them together, and placed them carefully into a manila folder labeled A Dispute. It was the most organized he had been since the move, since Diane left, and maybe that meant something. Later that day, he drove across town to Steve Mitchell's law office, a brick building sandwiched between a bakery and a yoga studio. Inside, The smell of printer toner mingled with cinnamon rolls as Jack handed Steve the folder. Steve, ever the quick thinker, skimmed through the documents, occasionally letting out soft grunts or sarcastic chuckles. Well, he said, looking up, they've got a problem. This isn't just vague, it's misleading. If anything, they promoted phishing. Jack exhaled, some part of him needing that validation. But it's not just about you, Steve added, tapping a finger on the HOA bylaws. It's about how they're governing the whole community. If this is how she treats residents, you can bet you're not the only one. We might be looking at a broader pattern. That phrase, broader pattern, lingered in Jack's mind as he drove home. So he did something that surprised even himself. He started knocking on doors. He began with the neighbors on his street. Maple Avenue was quiet that Tuesday afternoon. The kind of neighborhood where people work from home or work too much to be home. But slowly, cautiously, people answered. Jennifer Adams, a warm-faced kindergarten teacher who lived 2 doors down, listened patiently as Jack explained what had happened. Her brows furrowed. And when he finished, she let out a sigh. She fined me $300 last month, Jennifer said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Apparently, the daisies I planted weren't HOA approved. I didn't even know there was an approved list. I was going to fight it, but she trailed off, shrugging. It's easier to just pay, Jack nodded. But inside, something stirred. That exact resignation, the willingness to absorb injustice to avoid a fight, was how people like Patricia kept power. He moved on to George Williams, a retired accountant who had lived in Willow Creek since the subdivision was still construction dust and blueprint dreams. George was slower to open up. But once Jack mentioned the lake, it was as though a dam broke. I've been watching the HOA financials for a while, George said, leading Jack into his home office. A room filled with color-coded binders and laminated maps. No one listens to the old guy with spreadsheets, but you're not wrong to be suspicious. George showed Jack a binder labeled HOA Expenditures, 23. Inside were printouts of spending records, meticulously annotated in pen. Jack's eyes widened as he noticed a pattern: landscaping projects, lighting upgrades, and emergency maintenance disproportionately focused around the north side of the neighborhood, the side where Patricia Montgomery lived. That's her house, George said, pointing to a spot on a color-coded map. And that's where 62% of community improvement funds have gone in the past 18 months. Jack leaned in. You're saying she's funneling HOA money into projects that benefit her personally, George nodded. Or, at the very least, prioritizing them. Either way, she's making the rules, enforcing them, and writing the checks. That night, Jack sat on his porch with a notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen. Under the soft hum of porch lights and cicadas, he made a list. At the top, he wrote, find the pattern. Below that, names Jennifer, George, Bill, situations, flowers, fines, aesthetic violations, and then, at the bottom, he wrote a single question. Why fishing? Why now? The answer came 2 days later when he received a call from Nancy Taylor, the HOA secretary. I saw your post on the neighborhood forum, she said quietly, about fishing, and then about Patricia. Jack didn't even remember the post being that detailed. He had mostly written it out of frustration, asking if anyone else had been fined for things they thought were allowed. I can't talk on the phone, Nancy said. Can we meet? They agreed on a neutral location, a coffee shop just outside the community gates. When Jack arrived, Nancy was already there, seated in a corner booth, nursing a cup of herbal tea like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. I shouldn't be doing this, she whispered, sliding a folder across the table. But you're right, and people need to know. In my folder were unofficial board meeting notes, not the ones posted online, but the ones Nancy had saved before Patricia edited them. There was never a vote about banning fishing. Nancy said, in fact, we had 3 meetings last year where we specifically affirmed the lake's recreational use. Patricia started changing the wording in the public versions, said it was to clarify ambiguous language. But I've been keeping backups. Jack's heart pounded. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was proof. Nancy looked around nervously. There's more. Patricia's been meeting with a developer, a guy named Martin Rogers. I overheard them once. He wants to buy part of the lake area for a luxury townhouse expansion, but he needs lake access restricted first, otherwise the city won't approve the rezoning. Jack's blood ran cold. She's clearing the lake, he whispered, piece by piece. Nancy nodded. She even called it Phase 1. Fishing bans, then swimming, then fencing. By the time people notice, it'll be too late. Jack drove home in silence. He parked in his driveway and didn't get out for a full 10 minutes. The suburban dream, the lake, the peaceful weekends. The idea of starting over it was all being used as leverage in someone else's game. It wasn't just a $500 fine anymore. It was a war for something sacred. He walked into his house, pulled out his notebook, and scratched out the words, "Find the pattern." He wrote instead, "Stop the pattern." And under that, 3 new goals: expose the edits, uncover the deal, protect the lake. Because this wasn't just about him now. It was about every neighbor who'd been silenced by bureaucracy, every child who deserved to fish in the same waters their parents once did, and every quiet soul looking for peace on a lawn chair beside the rippling, reflecting glass of the lake. And Jack Anderson, once just a man trying to recover from divorce, was about to become something else entirely, the guy who refused to let a bully sell away the soul of a community. The days that followed were a blur of movement and momentum. Jack had never been an activist. He had never written a letter to a congressman or marched with a sign, but somehow this felt different. It wasn't politics. It wasn't ideology. It was personal. It was about something simple being taken away with arrogance and impunity, and it was about stopping that before it happened again. After the meeting with Nancy and the revelation about the development deal, Jack began to see everything differently. Every community bulletin now felt like coded language. Every landscaping crew that showed up unannounced near the lake made his pulse spike. Every silence from the HOA's official channel felt like a cover-up. He didn't waste time. That Saturday morning, Jack called Steve again and gave him a quick rundown of everything Nancy had shared. Steve's reaction was immediate and sharp. "Jack," he said, "this is bigger than just your fishing fine. If she's falsifying board records and leveraging her position for personal gain, this is fraud. It's actionable, and it can blow back on her hard." Jack exhaled. "So what's next?" "We build a case, but we also build a voice. If she's banking on people staying quiet, we make sure they don't. You up for a little door-to-door diplomacy?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." By mid-morning, Jack had created a simple flyer, just a black and white page titled "Concerned about Willow Creek Below," that, a few bullet points, $500 fines for fishing in a recreational lake. The whole meeting minutes changed without board approval. "Potential real estate development on our community lake. Let's talk. Informal neighbor gathering. Jennifer's backyard. This Sunday, 5 p.m. Bring a chair, your stories, and your voice." He printed 50 copies and hit the pavement. He slipped flyers under doors, in mailboxes, even pinned one to the community board at the clubhouse while nervously watching over his shoulder. On Sunday, the turnout shocked him. Jennifer had set up folding chairs in rows, with pitchers of iced tea and a few trays of cookies on a folding table near the bath. People came in, hesitant at first, milling near the edges, but by 5:10, there were nearly 30 residents gathered, some he knew, some he had only seen in passing. What united them all was that same look in their eyes: frustration, uncertainty, and a flicker of hope. Jack stood at the front, his palms sweating slightly as he held a stack of notes he barely glanced at. "Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Anderson. I'm the guy who got fined for fishing." That got a chuckle, light but genuine. It broke the ice. What started as a simple misunderstanding has turned into something else. He continued, "Some of you have already spoken with me. Some of you haven't. But I'm starting to believe that what's happening in our neighborhood isn't just a few small rules being misinterpreted. It's a pattern, and it's hurting us." He paused. "I've spoken with residents who were fined for planting the wrong flowers, for having the wrong mailbox, for using the lake. I've reviewed documents that suggest those fines and our HOA funds aren't being applied fairly. More than that, I've learned there may be plans to sell part of our lake to a private developer. Without our knowledge, without our vote, the crowd shifted. Murmurs broke out. But this isn't about me, Jack said quickly. It's about us. And it starts with us being informed, being connected, and standing up when something feels wrong. He stepped aside. You don't have to believe me. Listen to each other. That's when Frank Sullivan, a tall man in his 70s with a veteran's bearing, stood up and cleared his throat. I've been living here for 11 years, he said, and I've been fishing in that lake since the first sidewalk was poured. Nobody ever had a problem with it. Until now, until one person decided her rules mattered more than our community. One by one, others stood. Jennifer shared her flower fine. George brought copies of his financial spreadsheets. An elderly woman named Eleanor brought printed photographs of children fishing by the lake, some of them nearly 2 decades old. The stories kept coming. A man fined for placing a flag on his lawn. A couple warned about having too many guests parked on the street. A single mother asked why her request to use the clubhouse for her child's birthday had been denied while Patricia's wine club met there weekly without question. The air shifted from skepticism to clarity. From isolation to solidarity, Jack watched from the side, stunned by how quickly a community could transform when given space to speak. Then Rachel Miller raised her hand. I'm an attorney, she said calmly. I specialize in governance and compliance. I've only lived here 6 months. But based on what I'm hearing and what I've seen myself, there's a real chance that our HOA is operating outside its legal mandate. Heads turned. We need transparency, and we need it now. The meeting ended with a loose plan. Rachel and George would begin reviewing the bylaws. Jennifer would help organize future gatherings. Jack would continue investigating the development lead. And Steve, he offered to review any letters or fines residents wanted to challenge. That night, Jack sat on his porch again. Same mug, same chair, but something was different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of names, stories, and the electric current of change. But Patricia wasn't going to go quietly. The very next day, a new letter arrived at Jack's door, this time not from the HOA directly, but from an attorney named Michael Reynolds. Acting on behalf of a concerned board, the letter accused Jack of defamation, inciting community unrest, and spreading misinformation. It demanded a full retraction of his claims, an apology to the HOA, and payment of the original fine with an additional $200 penalty for administrative expenses. Jack brought it straight to Steve, who laughed as he read. This guy's an amateur, he said, flipping through the pages. There are 3 procedural errors in the first paragraph alone. This isn't a legal threat. It's a scare tactic. She's panicking. But that didn't make Jack feel better. If anything, it made things more unpredictable. 2 days later, Jack's manager at work called him into a Zoom meeting. Hey, Jack, his boss said awkwardly. I got a strange phone call today. Someone asking about your background. They didn't leave a name. Claimed to be doing a character audit for a neighborhood compliance committee. Jack's blood ran cold. I told them nothing. His boss added quickly, but just wanted to let you know. Weird stuff. Weird. Yes, but not random. That evening, Jack noticed a car he didn't recognize parked near his house. No one got out. It just idled for 20 minutes, then drove away slowly. He began taking different routes on his evening walks. He started locking every window, double-checking the back door. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about intimidation. Still, he didn't stop. The next community meeting was announced in a suspiciously quick email. Emergency HOA meeting. Wednesday, mandatory attendance. No agenda, no reason listed. Rachel raised an eyebrow when she read it. She's trying to beat you to the punch. She said, control the narrative before you do. But Jack smiled, because what Patricia didn't know was that George had already been in contact with a reporter, that Rachel had already printed out inconsistencies in the HOA's bylaws, and that Nancy had finally decided to speak out publicly. As Jack stood that night looking out over the lake, he saw more than just water. He saw a reflection of his own fight, still, deep, but dangerous when threatened. And in that reflection, He didn't see just a man trying to defend his right to fish. He saw the beginning of something much bigger, a reckoning. The sun had just started to rise over Willow Creek, casting soft amber light across the surface of the lake. But for the first time since moving in, Jack didn't feel peace standing by the water. Instead, a quiet storm was building in his chest, a storm of exhaustion, anger, and uncertainty. Despite the growing community support, the legal findings, and the stories piling up from neighbors, Patricia Montgomery hadn't slowed down, she had doubled down. 3 days after the emergency HOA meeting was announced, Jack received a second legal letter. This one more aggressive than the first. It didn't just demand retraction, it threatened legal action against his employment, citing reputational harm to the neighborhood. Enclosed was a veiled suggestion that if Jack didn't comply, the HOA board would review the terms of his home purchase approval, implying they could find grounds to challenge his right to live there at all. Jack slammed the letter down on his dining table and called Steve immediately. "She's trying to rattle you," Steve said, his voice calm but cold. "They're throwing darts in the dark. None of this is enforceable, but the real danger is what they do off paper." Jack already knew what that meant. His co-workers had grown distant. 2 friendly neighbors now avoided eye contact. One morning, someone left a trash bag tipped over on his lawn. Its contents scattered. No note, no confrontation, just quiet, deliberate sabotage. Jennifer dropped by with groceries one evening. She looked tense. "She's been calling people individually," she said, "telling them you're trying to ruin the neighborhood. That if the development falls through, home values will drop. She's making it sound like you're a threat to their investments." Jack stared at the floor. "I just wanted to fish." Jennifer gave a bitter laugh. "That's what makes this so insane." Even George, the spreadsheet warrior, had begun receiving anonymous emails accusing him of manipulating financial data. His mailbox had been knocked off its post. He replaced it the next day with a steel one. Still, they didn't stop. The informal group Jack helped ignite continued meeting in secret, away from the clubhouse, gathering in living rooms and backyards to trade information and compile evidence. Rachel and Steve worked together to draft a full legal response to the HOA, including a public demand for transparency, retraction of unjust fines, and full board meeting records. That's when the real crack in Patricia's armor appeared. Nancy texted Jack one evening, just overheard her yelling at Brian. "If the lake becomes unusable, no one can fight me over it." Jack's heart stopped. He called Steve immediately. "She's planning something." He said, "Something drastic. Sabotage?" Steve asked. "I think so, and we need proof." That night, Jack met Olivia Davis, the city planning officer who had been quietly reviewing the HOA's structure since Steve forwarded their concerns. They sat at a small diner downtown, away from the neighborhood. "You're right," Olivia confirmed. "I've gone through the original development records. The lake isn't fully HOA owned. It's actually classified as a public water feature maintained by the city under a community easement." Jack leaned back in disbelief. "She doesn't have jurisdiction to ban fishing, and she certainly can't develop the land without a public process." Olivia continued, "But if there's a threat of damage to the lake, we may need to act faster. Can the city step in?" Olivia nodded. "We can, but it'll be delicate. I'll authorize temporary surveillance just to monitor environmental integrity. If anything happens, we'll catch it." Jack didn't sleep that night. He kept imagining her, Patricia, standing at the edge of the lake, whispering orders into a phone, watching as someone poured something into the water. It sounded paranoid, but nothing felt impossible anymore. The very next evening, Jack was walking back from the small neighborhood library when he noticed headlights flicker near the lake's northern entrance, the one hidden behind a small grove of pines. 2 figures moved quickly down the slope. Jack ducked behind a tree and squinted. One of them carried what looked like a large plastic container. The other held a flashlight and a clipboard. They knelt by the water. Jack didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and snapped photos. Then he hit record, catching muffled voices as they poured something dark into the shallows. Jack stepped forward, not recklessly, but with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Hey," he shouted. The figures bolted, dropping the container as they scrambled up the slope. Jack ran to the water's edge. The container had a chemical label, partially peeled, but enough to read industrial algae suppressant, not for use in public waterways. Jack called Steve, then Olivia, then Rachel. By the next morning, the city had responded in full. They found evidence of recent chemical presence in the water. Surveillance footage captured the two men clearly. Neither were residents. They confessed after brief questioning, saying they'd been hired through a contractor and paid in cash. The source, a company registered to Montgomery Property Solutions. The connection was undeniable, and it was criminal. But Patricia didn't show signs of panic. Not yet. Instead, she fired back. She issued a community-wide email accusing certain residents of fabricating stories, forging documents, and inciting a campaign of case. She called for a mandatory community meeting at the clubhouse to address the misinformation and set the record straight. The email ended with a chilling line: "We must protect the harmony of Willow Creek from the inside out." Jack could feel the stakes rising like floodwaters. He met with Rachel and Steve the day before the meeting. "We have to go public." Steve said, "This is the climax. No more shadows. No more secret meetings." Jack hesitated. "If we lose, I don't think I can start over again." Rachel looked him dead in the eye. "Then let's make sure we don't lose." That night, George printed in large graphs showing financial discrepancies. Nancy brought flash drives with the original, unedited board minutes. Jennifer helped prepare testimonies from residents, and Daniel Wright, a journalist for the local paper, had already confirmed he'd be attending the meeting. They didn't just prepare for a meeting, they prepared for a trial. But when the night arrived, and Jack walked into the clubhouse, what he saw chilled him to the bone. Patricia stood at the front of the room like a queen in exile, surrounded by her loyalist board members, and beside her stood Martin Rogers, the developer, the man who wanted the lake. The room was full. Nearly every homeowner had shown up. There were whispers, side glances, folded arms, and narrowed eyes. But Patricia looked smug, too smug. Jack took a deep breath and scanned the crowd for his allies. Jennifer near the back, George clutching his map, Rachel by the exit, Steve at his side. And then, in the corner near the snack table, he saw Olivia Davis and someone new, a man in a city badge. They were ready. As Patricia opened the meeting with a syrupy speech about community values, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. She was rehearsed, confident, but as she segued into dismissing the rumors about lake misuse, Olivia stood up. Her voice was steady. "I'd like to clarify the city's position on the lake," she said. "It is public land, under city protection. No development may proceed without our approval, which has not been granted. Any environmental damage is a serious legal matter." The room shifted. Confusion, then outrage. Martin Rogers quietly slipped out the side door. Jack stood next, his voice stronger than he expected. "I moved here for peace," he said. "I found a community that deserved better than secret deals and intimidation. I was fined for fishing in a lake that didn't even belong to the HOA. Then I was harassed, threatened, and followed, all because I asked a question, then George, then Rachel, then Jennifer. One by one, voices rose, and then Nancy stepped forward and played a recording. It was Patricia's voice. "If the lake becomes unusable, no one can fight me over it." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack looked across the room and saw something shift in people's eyes. The spell had broken. The room erupted into questions, shouts, demands. Patricia tried to shout over them, but no one was listening anymore. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew, and chairs scraped noisily across the polished clubhouse floor as residents stood up. Some in disbelief, others in fury. Jack stood motionless for a moment, watching it all unfold. Patricia's face was a mask of panic, eyes wide, mouth pressed into a tight line, jaw clenched with the desperation of someone realizing her grip was slipping fast. She attempted to regain control, slamming the gavel down on the podium. "This is completely out of context," she barked, her voice cracking at the edge of hysteria. That recording was manipulated. You're all being misled by a few disgruntled residents who are trying to destabilize our community, but no one was listening. The spell she held over Willow Creek, built on fear, control, and isolation, had broken. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about deceit, abuse, power. Olivia Davis stepped forward calmly, holding up a document from the city planning office. This is a formal notice. All development plans involving the lake are hereby frozen pending investigation. Additionally, the Environmental Protection Division will be launching a separate inquiry into recent chemical contamination. Gasps and whispers rippled across the room. Patricia swayed slightly at the podium, gripping the edge of the lectern as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Then came the final blow. Mark Jensen, the city environmental officer standing beside Olivia, cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. We have confirmation from 2 contractors who were caught tampering with the lake. They've signed affidavits stating they were paid in cash and instructed to make the lake appear toxic for recreational use. The payment was traced back to a shell company registered under Montgomery Property Solutions. All heads turned to Patricia. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in all of this, Jack felt something unexpected: pity, not for the woman herself, but for how far someone could fall in pursuit of control. Then it vanished as quickly as it came. Rachel stood next, her tone clinical and professional. I propose an emergency vote to suspend the current HOA board until an official audit and investigation can be completed. This includes revoking Patricia Montgomery's authority effective immediately. A chorus of seconded followed before Patricia could even speak. Hands shot up throughout the room. The vote wasn't close. Patricia, Brian, and 2 other loyalists were suspended on the spot. They stood awkwardly together as residents began to approach Jack, Rachel, George, and even Nancy, thanking them, sharing stories, and asking what would happen next. Patricia turned to leave, head held high, but steps unsteady. Jack didn't say anything. He just watched as the woman who had turned a peaceful lake into a battlefield disappeared into the shadows of her own making. But the battle wasn't over. In the following days, news of the HOA collapse spread beyond the neighborhood. The local newspaper published a front-page feature titled, "Fishing Fine Exposes HOA Corruption, Environmental Sabotage." The story included quotes from residents, snapshots of city documents, and even a blurry photo of the contractors pouring the chemical into the lake. The city launched a full audit into Willow Creek's HOA financial records. Olivia confirmed that multiple violations had occurred, including misappropriation of funds, failure to hold proper votes, and improper use of city-managed property. But Jack wasn't celebrating. He was tired, bone-deep tired. What had started as a quiet rebellion against a $500 fine had turned into a whirlwind of meetings, legal filings, threats, and sleepless nights. There were still reports to submit, restitution discussions to navigate, and the long process of rebuilding the HOA into something ethical and transparent. Still, there were signs of light. At the next informal neighborhood meeting, held not in secret this time, but openly in the clubhouse, Rachel was elected interim HOA president by unanimous vote. Frank Sullivan was voted onto the board, along with Jennifer and George. Nancy, now visibly lighter, agreed to stay on as secretary under the condition that meeting minutes would be publicly posted and reviewed by 2 non-board residents before distribution. Jack declined any official role. He wanted his peace back, but his role hadn't gone unnoticed. 2 days after the new board was sworn in, he received a call from Olivia. "Mr. Anderson," she said with warmth in her voice, "the city is launching a new initiative, a lake stewardship program. We'd like someone to lead it, someone with a personal stake in this lake, who's proven he'll fight for it." Jack blinked. "You want me? We'll provide a monthly stipend. But more than that, we want to support responsible community use, education, water testing, youth programs. We believe you're the right person." Jack didn't hesitate. "I'd be honored." The first official act of the stewardship program was a community cleanup event. Over 50 residents showed up armed with gloves, trash bags, rakes, and snacks. Children ran along the shore, laughing, picking up candy wrappers and soda cans. Elderly residents sat in lawn chairs and told stories about how the lake used to be. And Jack, standing knee-deep in the water with a net, with a net, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. Later that afternoon, while drying off on the shore, Jack spotted Nancy walking toward him, holding two fishing rods. "I've never actually tried this before," she admitted, "but you've made it look therapeutic." Jack smiled and took the rod. "Come on, I'll show you how to cast." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. Just before sunset, Nancy turned to him. "You know," she said, "I think the lake always needed a guardian. Someone to listen when it couldn't speak." Jack didn't reply right away. He looked out at the water, at the reflection of the clouds tinged in gold and fire, at a boy helping his sister bait a hook, at a neighborhood slowly knitting itself back together. Finally, he said, "I think it just needed someone not afraid to speak when others were silent." As the sun dipped below the tree line, Jack leaned back in his chair, the same old chair from the first day, the one Patricia had tried to shame him out of. But now it sat proudly by the lake, surrounded by friends, freedom, and the ripple of water that no longer carried fear but peace. It had taken everything: time, courage, trust, and more patience than he ever thought he had. But now, as he watched the line bob gently on the surface and heard laughter in the distance, he knew it had been worth it. The fight wasn't just about a fine, it was about dignity, and the right to cast your line into something bigger than yourself and know no one could take it away again. A few weeks had passed since the community cleanup, and life in Willow Creek had begun to shift in subtle but powerful ways. Where there had once been whispered complaints and weary resignation, now there was laughter echoing from porches, friendly waves between neighbors, and an unfamiliar but welcome sense of collective ownership. It was as though something had been lifted upon a weight, a curse, and in its place was a neighborhood finally learning to breathe again. Jack Anderson found himself at the center of this quiet transformation. Though not by design, he'd always preferred the background, the calm. But now, everywhere he went, whether down Maple Street or across the path to the lake, people stopped him, some to thank him, some to apologize for not speaking up sooner, some just to chat about the weather and whether the bass were biting. And while Jack appreciated the newfound warmth, he couldn't help but carry a twinge of caution, because he knew what most didn't. Patricia wasn't finished. Though she had been voted out, and her allies stripped of their power, Patricia had not disappeared entirely. She'd sold her house 2 weeks after the city's official audit began, and rumor had it she'd left the state. But Jack had received word quietly from Olivia and Rachel that Patricia had hired a private attorney to challenge her removal from the board on procedural grounds. It was a long shot, but enough to keep tensions alive. Jack did his best not to dwell on it. Instead, he poured his energy into the lake stewardship program. He coordinated volunteer shifts, worked with the environmental department on water quality testing, and began building a curriculum for local kids interested in fishing and conservation. What had begun as a lonely pastime had evolved into a kind of sanctuary for others as much as for himself. One Thursday morning, Jack was setting up signs around the lake for an upcoming youth fishing workshop when he noticed a city truck parked near the shoreline. A man in a reflective vest stood beside a utility marker, scribbling on a clipboard. Jack approached. "Everything all right?" he asked. The man looked up. "Routine check." He said, "Hydrology team's been monitoring water tables after that chemical incident. City just wants to make sure nothing spread downstream." Jack nodded, grateful for the diligence, but something about the man's tone felt off, too casual, almost dismissive. Still, Jack let it go. The lake was finally in safe hands. Wasn't it that evening? He mentioned the encounter to Rachel during their weekly stewardship planning meeting. She frowned. "City contractors don't usually do unannounced inspections," she said, "especially not with environmental flags still active." "Do you remember the company name?" Jack shook his head. "Didn't catch it. Truck didn't have a logo." "Now that I think about it," Rachel scribbled a note. "I'll follow up with Olivia, just to be safe." 2 days later, Jack was walking along the lake's southern path when he noticed a small patch of grass near the waterline that looked different, wilted, darkened, like it had been scorched. He knelt down and rubbed the edge of a leaf between his fingers. It crumbled into dust. He took photos and sent them to Olivia. Within hours, a team from the environmental department was on site, collecting samples. The test results confirmed Jack's unease trace amounts of a banned herbicide were present, strong enough to affect aquatic life if exposure increased. And most alarmingly, the substance wasn't a leftover from the earlier incident. It was new. Olivia called him directly that evening. "We don't want to panic anyone yet," she said, "but we're treating this as a second attempt at contamination." Jack stared at the lake through his window, the moonlight shimmering across its surface. "You think Patricia's behind it?" Olivia was silent for a moment. "We don't know, but whoever did this had to be familiar with the area. And it wasn't an amateur job." Jack's stomach twisted. The community had come so far, and now it was under threat again. The next day, Rachel organized a closed-door meeting with Jack, Olivia, Steve, and George. They met at George's house, his office walls still lined with charts and HOA financial records, though now they were joined by civic maps and soil charts. "This is an attack," Rachel said bluntly, pacing the room. "And if we're right, it's not just about revenge. It's about sabotage." Steve leaned forward. "Patricia has no legal path back onto the board, but if she can prove the lake is irreparably damaged or that the HOA was negligent, she might be able to push a liability claim. If successful, she could sue for damages, argue for reinstatement, or pressure a settlement." George let out a low whistle. "She's trying to burn the house down on her way out." "So how do we stop her?" Jack asked. "We document everything," Olivia said. "We expand surveillance. We tighten volunteer shifts, and we alert the city attorney." The next week became a blur of action. Jack and a few other volunteers began rotating night patrols around the lake. Olivia's department installed motion-triggered cameras along the northern and southern paths. Rachel compiled a legal brief to present to the city, outlining the timeline of contamination events. And Steve filed a protective order against further third-party development until the environmental review concluded. But the community had changed too much to fall silent again. At the next HOA meeting, now chaired by Rachel, the room was packed. Residents brought concerns, ideas, and offers to help. Teenagers volunteered to create a digital newsletter. Parents asked for more educational events by the lake. Retirees offered to host history nights, sharing the early years of Willow Creek before the HOA even existed. It was no longer just a neighborhood. It was becoming something real, whole. Yet, the shadow still loomed. One evening, Jack received an anonymous email through the stewardship program's contact form. No name, no greeting, just 2 lines. "You think you've won. But there's more than one way to poison a lake." He forwarded the message to Olivia, who traced the IP address back to a library in a neighboring county. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to increase patrols again. Still, Jack refused to let fear reclaim what the community had fought for. He pushed forward with the youth workshop. That Saturday morning, over 20 kids and their families gathered by the lake, laughter and excitement buzzing in the air as Jack taught them how to bait a hook, cast a line, and gently release a catch back into the water. At one point, a boy tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Mr. Jack," he said, his eyes wide. "Is it true you saved the lake?" Jack chuckled. "No, buddy. I just reminded everyone it was worth saving." After the event, Nancy joined Jack by the water. She held a thermos of lemonade and offered him a cup. "You've changed this place," she said, her voice soft. Jack shook his head. "No, this place changed itself. I just made a little noise." Nancy smiled. "Maybe, but sometimes noise is all it takes to wake people up." Jack looked out at the lake. The kids still running along its edge, parents chatting on picnic blankets, and the sunlight glinting off the water like a promise. The fight wasn't over. Patricia might still be lurking in the shadows, fighting for another opening, but for now, the community was awake, united, and vigilant. And as Jack cast his line into the lake one more time that evening, he realized something unexpected. He no longer felt like a man recovering from something. He felt like a man building something new. The first signs of fall had arrived at Willow Creek. Leaves tinged with amber and rust swirled in soft breezes that curled around rooftops and danced across the lake's surface. The oppressive heat of summer had finally broken, and with it, a sense of calm had begun to settle over the community. For the first time in months, Jack Anderson could breathe without bracing for the next blow. But beneath the surface, he knew something was stirring. The city's investigation into the second contamination attempt was still ongoing, but Olivia had quietly informed Jack and Rachel that a third party had been identified, a subcontractor with no direct ties to Patricia, but connections to her old real estate firm. While the evidence didn't explicitly name her, it was enough to keep the city's legal department involved, and enough to convince the new HOA board to request a formal injunction against any development proposals involving lakefront property for at least 12 months. Still, Jack felt the tension like a string stretched tight beneath the calm. He noticed it in the way Rachel sometimes paused during meetings, choosing her words with precise care. He heard it in Steve's voice during their weekly check-ins, cautious but ready, and he felt it most of all in the silence that had followed Patricia's last legal motion, a request for an arbitration hearing to determine whether her removal from the board had violated HOA procedural codes. It's her last move. Rachel had told him after reviewing the paperwork, if she can get a judge to buy that the vote was invalid, she might demand reinstatement or worse, damages. She's trying to rewrite history, Jack replied. She always has been, Rachel said. In the meantime, Jack doubled down on the one thing that kept him grounded: the lake. He added new signs around the shoreline with facts about local fish species. He organized a partnership with a local biology teacher to bring students to the lake for outdoor science classes. And he launched a weekend mentorship program for teenagers interested in environmental science and wildlife conservation. It was during one of those Saturday sessions that something unexpected happened. As Jack wrapped up a lesson about aquatic ecosystems, a silver sedan pulled up near the volunteer tent. A woman stepped out, sharply dressed, her heels clicking against the path. She was older than Patricia, but with the same air of authority and calculation. "Mr. Anderson," she asked. Approaching, Jack stood, shielding his eyes from the sun. "That's me. I'm Elise Warner," she said, offering a firm handshake. "I'm an attorney representing a consortium of investors who had a financial interest in the Willow Creek development proposal. I'm here on behalf of Martin Rogers and his associates." Jack's expression tightened. "You're a little late to the party," Elise smiled thinly. "You might be under the impression that the matter is closed. It's not. I'm aware of Patricia's arbitration request. We've responded." Elise tilted her head. "This isn't about Patricia. This is about the land, the lakefront parcel. My clients believe they had a legitimate path to development, and the city's interference, based largely on your complaints, has jeopardized that." Jack folded his arms. "My complaints stop someone from poisoning a public water source. I'm not here to argue ethics," Elise replied. "I'm here to advise you that my clients are exploring civil options. If the HOA can't resolve the matter internally, we may need to involve outside mediation." Jack stared at her, anger flickering just below the surface. "You can sue whoever you want, but this community isn't for sale. Not anymore." Elise studied him a moment longer, then gave a short nod. "We'll be in touch." As she left, Jack turned back to the teenagers now packing up their gear. One of them, Miguel, a quiet kid with a sharp eye for detail, looked at Jack and asked, "Who was that?" Jack forced a smile. "Just someone who doesn't understand what this place means." That night, Jack sat down with Rachel, Steve, and George for an emergency strategy session. "She's not bluffing," Steve said. "They're playing the long game now. If they can't win through Patricia, they'll try through pressure, fatigue, and legal attrition. They'll aim to make this so costly and exhausting that someone, somewhere, compromises. Then we don't give them the chance." Rachel said, "We go public again. We remind everyone what happened. The contamination, the threats, the money trail. The town needs to remember this wasn't about red tape. It was about protecting something irreplaceable." George nodded. I'll update the financial impact maps. I've already traced the payments from Roger's company to a shell entity used for lobbying local HOAs, and I'll talk to Daniel at the paper. Jack said he's been waiting for something like this. Within a week, a new article hit the front page. Developers circle Willow Creek again community stands firm. It laid out everything: the original fishing fine, the manipulation of board records, the lake sabotage, and the ongoing legal maneuvering. The response was swift. Letters poured in. Support from other neighborhoods, messages from retired HOA board members in different counties sharing similar stories. Even the city council took notice and scheduled a special session to revisit zoning ordinances involving private public water easements. Still, the most powerful moment came during the next community forum. Dozens of residents gathered at the lake, not for protest, but for presence. They brought picnic blankets, folding chairs, and trays of food. Jack stood at the water's edge and looked out at the families, the elderly couples, the teens skipping rocks and kids chasing dragonflies. Then Frank Sullivan stood up, the grizzled veteran, once skeptical of all HOA politics. Spoken to a megaphone someone handed him. "We used to think someone else would fix it," he said. "We thought maybe this wasn't our problem." But Jack showed us it was. Not just the lake, but the way power hides in silence. And that if we don't protect what we love, someone else will try to profit from it. Applause echoed off the trees. Nancy followed him, standing with visible nerves but firm voice. "I was part of the old guard. I looked the other way for too long, but no more barbecue. This community belongs to its people, not to contracts written behind closed doors." Later, as the sun dipped and the lake glowed gold, Rachel stood beside Jack and whispered, "Do you see it?" Jack nodded. "For the first time, I think we've actually won the heart of this place." Rachel smiled. "Then let's make it permanent." In the weeks that followed, the new HOA board passed a resolution unanimously supported by residents to declare the lake a protected community sanctuary. They filed a petition with the city to formalize the designation, including a clause that prevented any commercial development within 500 feet of the shoreline. The arbitration hearing with Patricia moved forward, but her claims were swiftly dismissed due to procedural violations and overwhelming community testimony. The threat from Martin Rogers faded into the background as the consortium withdrew their interest. Citing unfavorable public sentiment, Jack finally returned to the water, alone one morning, casting his line in silence. Not because he needed to escape, but because he wanted to feel it again. The stillness, the peace, the simplicity of a man in a lake, bound by memory, grief, and hope. He reeled in nothing that day, but he didn't mind. He had already caught everything that mattered. Fall deepened in Willow Creek, painting the trees in strokes of crimson and gold. The breeze carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the lake, as if aware of its newfound status, shimmered with a kind of quiet dignity. The waterline was dotted with new benches, small signs explaining local wildlife, and tidy gravel paths maintained by volunteers. It no longer felt like just a backdrop to suburban life. It felt like the soul of the neighborhood claimed, protected, and reborn. Jack Anderson sat on one of those benches just after sunrise, wrapped in a navy flannel jacket, a thermos of coffee warming his hands. His fishing rod rested beside him, the line drifting idly into the water. It wasn't about catching anything today. It hadn't been for a long time. This was about presence, about being part of something that had once been threatened and now stood defiantly whole, across the lake. He could see Miguel and a few other teenagers setting up for the final youth fishing workshop of the season. A year ago, none of them had even known how to tie a line. Now they moved with quiet competence, laughing as they argued over bait techniques and the merits of night crawlers versus power bait. That, more than any legal victory or board resolution, was what told Jack the fight had been worth it. He thought back to how it all began: a single afternoon by the water, a fine he didn't deserve, a voice that told him he didn't belong. Patricia Montgomery had nearly succeeded in turning this lake into a monument to power and profit. But she hadn't counted on resistance. She hadn't counted on how deeply people needed something unspoiled. And she certainly hadn't counted on the stubborn, quiet man she tried to humiliate. When the city council formally approved the designation of Willow Creek Lake as a protected community sanctuary, they'd held a ceremony. Jack had stood off to the side, watching Olivia Davis read the proclamation, flanked by Rachel, Steve, and the rest of the new board. There were speeches and applause, even a local news crew. But the part Jack remembered most was when an elderly woman, Eleanor, who had once shown him photos of her late husband teaching their grandchildren to fish, took his hand in both of hers and whispered, "You brought our memories back." That simple sentence stuck with him, because it wasn't just about preserving a lake. It was about restoring meaning to a place people had stopped believing in. And in doing so, something had been restored in Jack too. The divorce, the move, the isolation. It had all felt like unraveling. But through the conflict, the community, and the purpose that emerged, he'd found something he hadn't expected to recover a sense of self. Later that day, during the youth event, Jack stood with Miguel and handed out certificates to each participant. Nothing fancy, just their names, a gold seal, and the words Certified Lake Steward, Willow Creek. Some kids grinned with pride, others shrugged awkwardly, but one boy, maybe 9 years old, clutched his certificate like it was a trophy. He walked up to Jack after the group photo and asked, "Do you think I could teach my little brother how to fish, even though he's only shims?" Jack smiled. "If you know how to be patient, you already know how to teach." The boy nodded solemnly. "I'm really good at waiting." Jack laughed. "Then you'll be great." That evening, as parents packed up and the teens carried tackle boxes back to their cars, Rachel walked over to Jack, hands in her coat pockets, her breath visible in the cooling air. "You know," she said, looking out at the lake, "there was a time I thought we might lose all of this." Jack nodded. "There was a time I thought I had nothing left to fight for. You proved us both wrong." He looked at her, not answering right away. Rachel continued, her voice softer. "Next month, the board's voting on a new community engagement program, speaker series, art exhibits, maybe even storytelling nights by the lake. You in? I don't really do microphones." "Who said anything about a microphone? Just you, a chair, and a story." Jack considered it. "Maybe. Think about it," Rachel said, patting him on the arm before walking away. Jack sat there a while longer after everyone had gone, the lake settling into dusk. He thought about stories. Not just the kind people told, but the kind they lived. Stories shaped by resistance, by quiet courage, by people choosing each other over fear. That's what Willow Creek had become, a living story written by its residents, page by page. He remembered the day Patricia had threatened him at the water's edge, declaring that fishing degraded the aesthetic. That moment had lit a fire in him, not just because of the injustice, but because of how easily a voice of power assumed it could silence the ordinary. But now, standing by that same water, Jack knew that power had been undone not by noise or protest alone, but by persistence, facts, and community. The HOA, now under Rachel's leadership, had published a full transparency report. Every budget decision was public. Meetings were recorded and shared. Fines were no longer arbitrary, and a refund initiative had already returned thousands of dollars to residents unfairly targeted in the past. The clubhouse bulletin board now featured gardening tips, fishing schedules, and a rotating neighbor spotlight highlighting residents' contributions. Jack had somehow been featured twice, once for the Lake Stewardship Program, and once, to his horror, for a photo of him teaching a small girl how to untangle her reel. Steve, ever the cynic turned believer, had helped Rachel draft a proposed HOA Bill of Rights, a resident-first charter that other neighborhoods began requesting copies of. Even Daniel Wright from the local paper had followed up with a feature titled, "The Neighborhood That Fought Back and Won." And yet, Jack didn't feel victorious. He felt responsible, not in the burdensome way he once did, but in a way that meant presence, being there, showing up, staying even when things got hard. The next weekend, Jack returned to the lake early. He carried 2 rods this time. One was his own, the other, older and scratched, had once belonged to his grandfather. He placed it on the bench beside him, as if honoring a memory that had started all of this. As the sky brightened, a woman passed by with her daughter. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed. "Look, Mommy, that's the lake man." Jack smiled, nodded politely, and cast his line. It wasn't long before a gentle tug reached his fingertips. He reeled in slowly, patiently, as his grandfather had taught him. A small bass surfaced, flipping its tail in the air, then dove back in as Jack released the hook. He sat back. A year ago, he had been fined $500 for fishing. Now, he was paid a stipend to teach others to do it with care. A year ago, he was alone. Now, he was part of something woven together by resilience and choice. He looked over his shoulder at the new sign near the trailhead. Clean. White letters on dark wood read, Willow Creek Public Lake, Fishing. Welcome maintained by the city and community volunteers. Jack took a sip of coffee from his thermos, felt the breeze lift across the water, and whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. We kept it safe. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the most meaningful catch of all.